Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. You are at the event Understanding Transboundary Climate Risks, the Need for Global Adaptation. And I suggest we will wait for one more minute for people to join us. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Understanding Transboundary Climate Risks, the Need for Global Adaptation. This week, exactly 5 years ago, 3 European think tanks, IDRI, ODI, and SEI, published a discussion paper called Meeting the Global Challenge of Adaptation by Addressing Transboundary Climate Risk. That was the beginning of what is now the Adaptation Without Borders partnership. And we're very happy to present to you today the first flagship report of the partnership. It was published yesterday, and a long list of authors have worked on it with support from the European Commission. And I'm very happy that we have gathered with so many here to listen to some of the authors and present the results, and also to hear some reflections from policy and practice. We have about 500 people who signed up for this event. Some of them are here, others are joining us on the live stream on YouTube, and others will be listening later on as this is being recorded. We have a relatively packed agenda, and I will quickly go through that, and then have a few housekeeping messages. So after we have gone through the agenda, Katie Harris, Director of Adaptation Without Borders, will give a brief introduction, and then we'll hear from the two main editors of the report, Ariadna Anisimov and Alexandre Magnon, and that will be followed by 4 of the authors. We'll hear 4 chapters being introduced on 4 specific transboundary climate risks that were presented in the report. That will be followed by questions and answers. And on that, I would encourage everybody to put as many questions that you would like to ask in the chat. There is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen that you can use for that. And authors could already consider answering those questions in writing, but we'll also have the opportunity to hear from the authors or from others during that Q&A session. Following that Q&A session, we will then have a video message from Her Excellency Aminat Shona from the Maldives, Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology. And that will be followed by reflections by Salim Al-Hook, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. And hopefully time will allow for further question and answers at that point. And then I will conclude the session. So we'll be here for 2 hours, and hopefully we will not only get a good idea of what is in the report, but also a good idea of the importance of managing transboundary climate risks. And Katie will say more about that in a minute. I think I have said everything that needs to be said in terms of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded. The link will be available on the IDRI website as well as the Adaptation Without Borders website soon after the event, and you can also see it on YouTube. I would suggest that everybody mutes themselves, and the speakers, of course, have their cameras on. Over to you, Katie.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Let me get up my slides. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to welcome you all to this webinar. As Richard said, my name is Katie Harris. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and also have the pleasure of coordinating the Adaptation Without Borders Global Partnership. And I'm going to speak for just a few minutes on what transboundary climate risks are, and how the Adaptation Without Borders Partnership is seeking to strengthen our management and governance of those. So Adaptation Without Borders. We are a global partnership working to strengthen international cooperation on adaptation to manage the transboundary and cascading impacts of climate change. So what are transboundary climate risks? Well, they manifest when an impact from climate change in one country generates risks to people in another, or when an impact from adaptation in one country or context generates risks to people in another. And these risks can spread between neighboring countries. We might think of two countries that share a river, for example, but they can also connect communities and spread between countries that are actually many thousands of miles apart. And you'll hear a lot of examples of those sorts of risks today. But there are three key problems that we see. First of all, we really don't yet understand, let alone well manage, the propagation of climate risk between countries. We often think of adaptation as being an inherently good thing, but actually adaptation can also have cross-border effects. It can redistribute rather than reduce vulnerability between countries. And most of our national adaptation plans are defined pretty independently from one another. They often struggle to account for this transboundary nature of risk, and they do little to spur international cooperation on adaptation that could strengthen the management of these risks. So why does this matter? Well, our research indicates that if we leave transboundary climate risks unchecked, they could impede progress towards many of the Sustainable Development Goals. So increasing food and water insecurity, threatening trade and energy supplies, risking jobs and livelihoods, escalating geopolitical instability around the world, spurring social inequality, and undermining social and economic development. We believe such risks will become a defining issue for climate diplomacy, including in UNFCCC negotiations in the years ahead. And we're seeing growing demand from governments in the global south and north alike to better consider these risks in our adaptation planning and build resilience to climate change on a truly global and transformative scale. And as the UNFCCC Executive Secretary Simon Steele says, climate change does not respect borders and boundaries, but what it does do is impact the lives of people globally. So, Adaptation Without Borders, as Richard said earlier, is a partnership that brings together organizations from across 4 continents. We work together to try and identify and assess these transboundary climate risks. to appraise policy options that could better manage these risks, to catalyse stronger international and multilateral cooperation on adaptation, and to really work with those managing and funding adaptation programmes to co-develop climate resilient solutions that will enhance our preparedness and strengthen our resilience to these risks. There are currently 12 organisations that form part of Adaptation Without Borders. That list is growing, and we really encourage you to reach out to us if your organisation is working on the international nature of climate risk. And those partners bring a whole range of different expertise, but that includes significant regional expertise and understanding of these sorts of risks, including from Europe, in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, as you'll hear more about later today, in the Caribbean, in West and Central Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And we have 3 strands to our work. We develop policy-driven research and evidence. So we aim to provide breakthrough insights on globally significant transboundary climate risks and some of the pathways through which they propagate. And the report that we're launching today is really at the cornerstone of this pillar of our work. We also work directly with policymakers to harness opportunities at different levels, across different policy domains, not just within climate, but also within trade and foreign policy and security, and through different modes and through different levels to spur greater cooperation and coordination on adaptation. And we work very closely with national and regional and local adaptation planners to better manage transboundary climate risks in practice, and also the impacts of those adaptation plans and actions on others around the world. So just before I hand over to Ariadna and Alex to introduce the report, I thought I'd give you a quick snapshot of how the international community are working towards a reconceptualization of climate risk. So under the UNFCCC, we're seeing transboundary climate risks really rise up the agenda. The 2021 technical report from the Adaptation Committee on the Global Goal on Adaptation has a significant focus on transboundary climate risk and the existing transboundary approaches to assessing adaptation progress. We're also seeing these risks become a more regular focus of the UNFCCC adaptation negotiations. We have been requested to provide multiple presentations on these risks, and we've seen many interventions from parties and groups on the need to consider these risks more deeply in the negotiations. And we see 3 key opportunities under the UNFCCC to strengthen the management of transboundary risks. So the first on the global goal on adaptation, and you'll hear more on this from Minister Shauna later on in the programme, particularly the opportunities that the Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh work programme on the global goal on adaptation and the framework that is being developed this year that was announced at COP27 to strengthen global cooperation on adaptation to manage these risks. We also feel it is very important that the global stocktake really accounts for the needs, the challenges, and the opportunities of assessing transboundary climate risk and how we're doing, our levels of progress in building resilience to them. And we also see a number of opportunities for transboundary climate risks to be featured much more strongly in countries' national adaptation plans, and for there to be stronger peer learning processes between countries on how to do so. And lastly, I just wanted to say 3 key points, which is that a number of regions are starting to think about how they can play a role in managing the transboundary climate risks that their country members face. So the ASEAN State of Climate Change report from 2021, for example, places the assessment of transboundary climate risks and actions as one of their prioritized areas for enhancing adaptation by 2030. The 2021 EU adaptation strategy recognizes that climate change can have these knock-on effects, that climate change impacts from outside the EU can create consequences that cascade and spill over into the EU, and that stronger international action and cooperation on adaptation is needed. And the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan that takes us up into 2032 really articulates the need to enhance coordination between the regional economic communities and member states in addressing and managing transboundary and cascading climate risks. So that's a quick snapshot of what such risks are and how some of the regional bodies and organizations and the international community are starting to recognize these risks. But I'll hand back to Richard, who can introduce the next stage in the program. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Katie, for the introduction. I forgot to introduce Katie. She is Director of the Adaptation Without Borders Global Partnership. We next have the two editors of the report that we are launching today, and they are Ari Anissimo from the University of Antwerp and Alexandre Magnan from IDRI. Over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, Richard. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really our pleasure to launch this first flagship report of the Adaptation Without Borders Partnership. Let me just share my screen. Alex, my colleague and I, as lead coordinators of this report, will give a brief overview of the report, in addition to a bit of a look into the deep dives that we both led. So I'm going to share my screen, and please confirm that everything. All right.
This is working. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. So here we are launching officially our first flagship report. This report brought together leading experts from various organizations worldwide. So it's really a collaborative effort, bringing in wealth of expertise and richness. So both we have authors from the founding members, SEI, IDRI, and ODI, but also from partners of the Adaptation Without Borders Partnership, IGES and ECMOD, and new collaborators with us on this report, such as IEA, the London School of Health and Tropical Medicine, and EDHEC Business School. So the report is really a culmination of what we've been working on for several years now under the partnership. It provides this first comprehensive package of assessing and analyzing different types of transboundary climate risks. And we structured it in three parts. The first part is really a characterization, looking at the different types of characteristics of these different transboundary climate risks, and also understanding their dynamics, different types of impacts, both direct and indirect, that could occur, and the first identification of big risk themes, which I'll present in a moment. Part two allows to look deeper into these different themes. So we created this sort of thematic transboundary climate risks that are globally significant, and each chapter provides illustrative case studies. And the third part opens up the way forward, looking at policy and governance across scales and what that means for ways forward. In this first part, when we talk about transboundary climate risks, we just wanted to make sure that we were clear that we're looking at both climate-related hazards as triggers, but also adaptation. So the idea of maladaptation and what that means across borders, and the different spatial and temporal dynamics. So some transboundary climate risks might be more regional, some more global. And what does that mean really for how you can understand the flow of impacts, both direct and indirect, both for people, for development, and different sectors interconnected, but also understanding risk ownership in the stages of preparedness and management. So the adaptation options available in different parts along the pathways, whether it's at the source, along the pathway, or at the point of impact. In this first report, we also identified 10 globally significant transboundary climate risks. These are identified across ecosystems, economies, and societies. And also we identified a cross-cutting theme based on a review of different adaptation strategies, such as the EU adaptation strategies, and also from the IPCC assessment reports. So in the ecosystems larger category, we identified terrestrial shared natural resources and also ocean and coastal shared natural resources as key areas of transboundary climate risks. In economies, we identified agricultural commodities, global industrial supply chains, energy networks, finance. And in the societies category, we have human health, human mobility, and livelihoods. And finally, a cross-cutting chapter that looks at well-being, peace. So across these 10 themes, each lead author had to characterize more broadly the theme itself and what that could mean for transboundary climate risks, but also look deeper into an illustrative case study to really dig deeper into the dynamics and an assessment of the characteristics of the transboundary climate risk. And this is where we combined all together these illustrative case studies across the 10 deep dives, looking and mapping out where they took place. So what was the trigger? What were the impacts, both direct and indirect? And mapped out these to show that transboundary climate risks is really a global issue and is not just focused on impacts in one country or one direction of impacts, but really that all places could be affected in one way or another. And so across these deep dives today, we have several lead authors, 6 actually of the different deep dives. So we'll be looking a bit more closer into what this could potentially mean in terms of policy and governance gaps and opportunities. And now I think I hand over the presentation to my colleague, Alex.
Thanks, Ari, and hi to everyone. Yeah, so as you saw in the previous map, you have a bigger one in the report, of course. We have these 10 areas of interest, and for each of them, we dive deeper into some concrete examples, also to be convincing that these transboundary climate risks are really happening now, but there are also governance arrangements that are in place, and that can be useful to share lessons. So the next speakers will dive into some of the examples, but you will see that on this map that we have some things, for example, on finance. The case study relates to extreme weather events in Mexico that are triggering transboundary climate risk for European investors, for example. And you have a lot of case studies like that, and we think that's insightful. And if you can go to the next slide, just a brief view on one of these example, which is on the ocean and coastal ecosystems and resources. And for example, in this chapter, we show how the fact that fish stocks in the Pacific, because of climate change, because of ocean warming, combining with extreme events such as El Nino and El Niña, shift in space. And this shift in space, triggered partly by climate weather, but also by climate changes, change the rules in terms of accessing to these resources for the different countries. And this is an interesting case because we see that El Nino and El Niña events trigger shifts in tuna movement for a long time. And some small island states there organize themselves to create a regional mechanism to help each of these countries to get access to the fishes, even if the fishes are not in their economic exclusive zone at one time of the year because of El Nino, but the fish move to another EEZ. And so there is a cooperation there to share the EEZs, if you want, and so to allow each of the countries to keep revenues as they are, even if El Nino or El Niña is happening at that moment. And climate change is starting to ask new questions around that, mainly because with climate change, the fishes are likely to move outside of these jurisdictions. And so the question is, okay, is this regional mechanism ready to deal with this new situation, and how will it work in the future? And many discussions and many challenges regarding this regional cooperation mechanism. And you understand quite intuitively that this is about also, of course, national revenues for these countries, but also international fishing agreements. So how will climate change challenge the existing arrangements is really a question that we try to address in this chapter. Maybe the next slide, Ari, and another example.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And another illustrative case study that we brought forward in the human mobility theme was this temporary seasonal labor schemes and the indirect impacts on remittances. So it takes a bit of a different approach, not looking at the climate hazard itself. I mean, the climate trigger could be for the seasonal sectors, but we're staying in the same region in the Pacific where governance arrangements have been created, notably between some of the larger industrial economies like Australia, that creates arrangements with smaller Pacific islands such as Kiribati, where migrant workers can come and engage in temporary seasonal labor, and the remittances that go back to the islands could be used for building resilience. However, with climate change, some of these sectors will change and shift due to the volatility. So this might have an impact on the demand and need for such migrant workers. And what would be the implications for that for remittances is another financial pathway that we identified in transboundary climate risks. And this also brings into question the governance about borders and labor migration rules and opportunities more in the long term about migrants, not only just coming and for temporary times, but also having the right to stay, and what does that mean in terms of choice and dignity and the conditions in which migrant workers are traveling. So really provide also a critical lens on transformative adaptation for such governance schemes, so that the responsibilization of climate change is not put on the migrant and dependencies on such schemes, but that there could be a way potentially forward in benefiting adaptation progress in both partner countries that take place that agree to such types of schemes. Thanks, Alex.
And if you go to the next slide, so you will understand that this topic of transboundary climate risk raises many questions on the research side, but also on the policy side, actually. And on the research side, the report identifies that there is still some gap in understanding this transboundary climate risk, and especially in terms of the methods to assess what they are today and what they could be in the future. So in the report, we developed some ideas on possible future research that could be of policy relevance. So you have two examples here, two figures, but it's about clarifying the research protocol to understand transboundary climate risk, also because, well, this is not so usual to address these transboundary issues. And so research has to structure a bit on that. Maybe something around identifying the right indicators to describe transboundary climate risk today. And also it's about developing methods to explore the future of transboundary climate risk. And here we develop some ideas. I won't go into the detail here. And the next slide is on the governance challenges. and you understand with a few examples, but you will have more information then in the next presentation. There are some gaps in policy and governance, and so this is about who should be concerned and possibly responsible of taking a transboundary climate risk in charge, what to do, when, who, which kind of arena, which kind of mechanisms. This is something that is quite new, and we need to have huge inputs on that in the coming years, and especially after the first GST this year. And basically, it's also about understanding transboundary maladaptation, which is honestly very, very difficult to capture, to appraise for the moment. But this is something that we need to move forward. We need to move forward on that. There will be political sensitivities around that, okay, but we also state in the report that there is an opportunity to help reframe adaptation around these risks and move forward in terms of coordination for
thanks,
resilience.
Alex. I'm afraid we, in the interest of time, will need to move. I think this was your final slide, wasn't it? Thanks so much, Ari and Alex, for this introduction to the 2023 Global Transboundary Climate Risk Report. We'll now hear from 4 of the authors who have worked on 4 of these risks that are presented in the report for a more detailed picture. First, we'll hear from Jakob Steiner on shared river corridors in mountain regions, the case of the Hindu Kush Himalaya. And Jakob is a fellow at the Himalayan University Consortium at Izimot in Nepal and at the University of Graz in Austria. We'll then hear from Jinsun Lim, who is a policy analyst at the International Energy Agency, about interconnected energy systems, tropical cyclones on the east coast of Africa. And then we'll hear from Christine Belisova, who is a senior lecturer in global population health at Imperial College London. And she will talk about transboundary climate risks in health and take a deep dive on infectious diseases. And then finally, we'll hear from Sarah Opitz-Stapleton, a research associate at the Overseas Development Institute in the UK, who will talk about cross-border risks to livelihoods. So we'll hear these 4 presentations in one go, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So, Jakob, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you, Richard, very much. Let me quickly share my screen.
Thank you.
You should see it now in presentation mode, right?
Yep, that's working.
Perfect. Good afternoon to everyone from Pakistan. Well, as you heard, my name is Jakob Steiner, and I would like to acknowledge my co-authors as well, Flip Weister, Veruska Muchone, and Arun Tresta from Izimot in Nepal and the University of Zurich in Switzerland. We looked at transboundary climate risks for terrestrial shared natural resources, and we chose to have a look at mass flows in mountain environments, specifically high mountain Asia, for a couple of reasons. A, that's our expertise. So in this region, we know what we are talking about. But B, mountains are also very, very sensitive to climate change. Right? So there is specifics, for example, glacier ice that only occurs in the Arctic or in high mountain environments. It's also challenging topographically, right? So you have a challenging environment to work with, but also politically often. It's difficult to reach those relatively remote areas. And governance looks a bit different there. And of course, at the same time, mountain ranges often actually are national borders at the same time. So that's why we think it's a nice example to look at transboundary climate risks in this context. Now, to start off, when I, as an engineer, right? So my background is in engineering and hydrology. When I look at these climate risks in these river corridors, I often do so a little bit limited in time and space. Right? I would look at like what this picture illustrates, for example, from a picture I took about 1.5 years ago. I look at the direct impacts of a mass flow on infrastructure, on the people, how many people were affected, and we would count that and we would look at that risk. But risks, of course, they travel much, much further in space and in time than water does. Now, and that's what we should be interested to look at, right? And I just want to emphasize that the people who are directly impacted by those hazards and risks eventually in mountain areas, they realize that already. So I give this example here, a discussion we had with a family that was heavily impacted by a very strong event in the central Himalaya. And we were discussing with the family, and you can see the woman talking here. You know, her house was destroyed. She lost family members in an event that happened here before this picture was taken. And this very moment, she basically tells us, look, you guys, like you scientists, you always come here. You ask me about this specific event. You ask which part of the day did it happen? You know, what mass came down? How many people were affected? That's all fine. Yes, it was traumatic, and it was a horrible event for her and her family. But then she said, the disaster for us actually started the morning after the flood, right? Because that's when they realized the connection to essentially infrastructure was disrupted, right? They did not have access anymore to health facilities for maternal health, a huge concern for them. Children would not be able to go to schools anymore because only, and this is 1 year after the event, because only one road was reconstructed, but the schools are somewhere off. Essentially, people from the community have left because they don't feel safe anymore, or their livelihoods were destroyed. So the person that would sell vegetables coming from outside is gone to the national capital. They're not there anymore. All the hairdressers have left because they don't feel safe anymore because their shops were destroyed and they could not afford to rebuild. So it had a large impact on her in the long term. And she realizes very much that we are talking about this propagating climate risk rather than just the hazard of this one single event. Now we try to visualize that in the chapter, in this overview figure. So this is from the chapter itself, where we emphasize that we look at climate drivers, right? In mountains, we are especially worried about the changing precipitation regime, more intense precipitation happening, which then in turn triggers more mass movements. Also, temperature is increasing faster in mountains than elsewhere on the planet, which again creates more instability. On the other hand side, we also have non-climate drivers, right? There is more exposure, there is more infrastructure built across borders as well for trade. Countries want to be connected across those borders and across the mountain ranges. There is also a lot of investment in hydropower infrastructure, for example, because those countries often are dependent on that as an energy source. It's not just the dam itself, but it's also the transmission lines, because you eventually have to export. You cannot just produce energy, you have to export as well. So these are the cascading risks that we are well aware of. And I would like to visualize that with some examples that I think are quite intriguing from the last couple of years. So one picture here, I took exactly, so that's just on the border between Nepal and China. And you can see here electric cars from China being transported across high mountain Asia, across the Himalaya for the target market in Kathmandu. Now, for those of you who know Kathmandu, know that it's a city that's subject to very bad air quality problems and also volatile prices for petrol. There's a big interest for electric cars, which would be a good thing, right? So there is a push towards electrification of transport. China has a big interest to actually supply that. The trade over these commodities to electrify Kathmandu's traffic is very much threatened by the insecurity along those trade corridors. And because you really don't want to lose one of those single cars being transported individually along the way. They're really expensive. That's just to visualize how different climate risks are also coming together here in these very remote regions. You have hydropower as well, of course. Dams are being built both in the upstreams and in the upstream country and in the downstream country, posing different challenges depending on where it's built. Also then in terms of maladaptation. Hydropower that is built downstream is concerned about what is happening upstream. They need to know how much supply is coming, but also what kind of mass movements are coming towards their infrastructure. They also need to know that for the grid to be able to export or import, however you see it, if you have a hydropower structure that is building upstream, you're impacting the water flow one way or another, right? So however you're using the hydropower structure to, for example, adapt yourself to hazards. Sometimes hydropower structures are used to dampen a flood wave, for example, that propagates down to the downstream. And if you do that, if there is too much diversion or retention, or if there is release at an inappropriate time for the downstream, that can have an effect on food production, even in the downstream country, which again then can propel
Could you wrap up, Jakob? Thank you.
Yes, I'm done at this point. So this is the last slide. But what we do have lacking is to bring that on to coordination on the national scale for policy responses. And I think that's why this report is so important, to show the appreciation for these knock-on effects of risks that propagate across borders, that we actually are able to take action. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jakob. That was really, really interesting. We'll go straight to Jinsun Lim from IEA, who will talk about interconnected energy systems with an example from the east coast of Africa. Jinsun, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity, and I'm happy to present our work on the transboundary climate risks in the energy sector we discuss in the report. So electricity networks are playing a fundamental role in delivering reliable electricity services. They support clean energy transitions by integrating renewable energy sources, and also enhance energy security, connecting diverse power sources. So transboundary interconnected networks enables to diversify and balance electricity demand and supply among countries by aggregating multiple sources of supply and loads across borders. However, interconnected networks can have trade-offs that transmit destructive climate impacts from one country to another. In general, electricity networks are considered as one of the most vulnerable parts to climate impacts in the electricity system, particularly if greenhouse gas emissions are not mitigated and the global temperature rises above 2 degrees Celsius. Electricity networks are projected to experience a larger number of climate-driven disruptions. According to the IEA's analysis, as you can see on the screen, under a low emission scenario, electricity networks are projected to face around medium level of risks related to rising temperatures or heavy rainfalls, flooding, tropical cyclones, and others. But the level of the climate risks will increase significantly under a high emission scenario, as you can see some red dots. So the impacts of the transboundary climate risks on the interconnected electricity networks, so you can see the table which summarizes all the different impacts under the rising temperatures and getting wetter, and also the tropical cyclones and strong winds and wildfires. For instance, heat waves and rising temperatures can reduce transmission capacity and lead to higher losses, and also cause grid failures by overheating them. And also floods and landslides can physically damage the networks. Strong winds and tropical type cyclones, of course, they can damage lines, poles, and transformers by toppling trees and branches. Wildfires can cause a fire and smoke, which can damage lines, poles, and substation equipment, and causing short circuit failures as well. So as a case study, I would like to talk about what happened when Tropical Cyclone Idai hit the east coast of Africa in 2019. This shows how the impacts of climate disasters can cascade into neighboring countries that has not been directly hit by those events. So Tropical Cyclone Idai was one of the most severe cyclones ever, and it led to ever in Africa, and it led to damages triggered by strong winds, severe flooding, and associated landfall. It damaged two major hydropower plants, and with flooding and excessive debris in Malawi. And these hydropower plants went offline, reducing Malawi's hydropower capacity by more than 80% and causing widespread power disruptions across the country for several days. In Mozambique, low-lying cities were devastated with a storm surge, and more than 500 customers were affected due to the physical damage to the electricity infrastructure as well. But these are not the only countries which suffered from Tropical Cyclone Idai. The adverse impacts cascaded into other countries which are not actually directly hit by the cyclone. Through the Southern African Pulse Pool, the damage cascaded into other countries. It destroyed pylons that supported the transmission line between Mozambique and South Africa, which led to massive interruptions in electricity services in South Africa, which is relying on electricity imported from Mozambique. It forces South Africa's electricity utility to go for load shed for weeks. And at the peak of the crisis, the peoples had their power interrupted 12 times in a 4-day period. Also, it doesn't really just stop as the power outages, but also it changed the demand patterns during the period because people need to rely on the backup generator from the diesel. So it clearly shows that building resilience of interconnected electricity networks against transboundary climate risk is very urgently required. So to enable energy systems adapt to increasing climate risks, so we say that 4 components should be enhanced. The first part is readiness to anticipate the climate change. And second one is robustness to withstand the gradual changes in climate. And third one is resourcefulness to enable the operation during the disruption, even after the outbreak of the disruption happened. And the fourth one is the recovery to restore the function as early as possible. And I would like to emphasize the role of policy measures in enhancing resilience of those interconnected networks. To minimize the adverse impacts of climate change on the energy sector and cascading risks, effective policy measures have a central role to play. Although businesses have a responsibility for and a direct interest in protecting their own assets and providing reliable services to their customers, they might be hesitant in implementing resilience measures on time because of high upfront cost of some of the resilience measures, while the return of investment could be tangible after a few years or even decades. Also, they will bear only a fraction of the entire socio-economic costs when the adverse impacts of the climate change happen, while the destructive impacts are spread across the society. Therefore, mainstreaming adaptation and resilience in national climate and energy policies needs to be the first step to send the right and strong signals to the businesses and investors. So many countries have already made progress in incorporating adaptation and resilience in their national policies, but some countries still climate resilience consideration is missing in the energy strategies in particular. I also want to emphasize that given that the climate risks are transboundary and crossing borders, so international collaboration is very much needed in the energy sector. For instance, a systematic and scientific assessment of transboundary climate impacts on the energy system can help governments and businesses to identify joint solutions. So for instance, we have assessed the climate change impacts on hydropower generation in Africa, emphasizing the key finding that the collaboration between the sub-regions, one of them will get drier due to the climate change and the other will get wetter after the climate projections, then they can help them adapt better to climate change. I also want to emphasize, although I'm currently talking about mainly about the interconnected electricity network, but our global energy supply chain is very interdependent and interconnected to each other. So further studies and discussions on the transboundary climate risks to the energy system will be also very much helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jensen. That was really excellent. We will go straight to Christine Belisova from Imperial College London, who will take us to transboundary climate risks and health. The floor is yours, Christine.
Thank you very much. Right, can you see me now?
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk about the deep dive into the infectious diseases transboundary risks. So to start, many of you already know that climate change through extreme weather events, heat stress, altering water quality and our food systems is already impacting health in many ways by increasing the burden of respiratory diseases, zoonosis, vector-borne diseases, and of course, non-communicable diseases. While infectious diseases is a particularly good example of how these risks are transmitted across boundaries. So climate change has already influenced the spread of vector-borne diseases globally over the past decade. And some of the examples of climate-sensitive infectious diseases are malaria, dengue, Zika virus, tick-borne encephalitis, and salmonellosis. In fact, these 5 diseases have caused already over 290 million cases of infections worldwide in 2019 alone. Many of them are transmitted by mosquitoes, some are transmitted by other vectors. And the issue is that these vectors often can't really regulate and control their own temperature. So their survival and replication really depends on the environmental conditions: temperature, precipitation, sunlight, wind, elevation above sea level. And as the weather parameters are changing and shifting, of course, the geographical distribution, prevalence, and the emergence of these diseases is also changing and shifting across the boundaries. And we've already evidenced the spread of West Nile fever in southeastern Europe, where it didn't used to be. We've seen shifts of malaria to higher altitudes in Colombia and Ethiopia, shifts in Lyme disease to higher altitudes and elevations in North America and Europe, and the emergence of chikungunya virus in the Latin America and the Caribbean, in Italy, and also elsewhere in Europe. which are all very worrying trends. And just to illustrate, here is a map of how dengue has evolved over the last number of decades, from being essentially contained in a couple of regions in South India and in Indonesia in 1940s and 1950s, to in the 21st century, essentially covering now a lot of South America, Mexico, southern USA, many parts in sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of South and Southeast Asia, as well as Australia. And of course, climate is not the only driver for this geographical shift and spread of dengue. There are many complex dynamics at play, which you can see here on the slide. And for example, some of the factors here are baseline health status, the coverage and quality of healthcare systems, hygiene practices, transportation, human migration, and various other behaviors, drug resistance, nutrition, and various environmental influences that alter the vector and the pathogen habitats and their interactions with people. So for example, agricultural development, deforestation, urbanization, and various water projects are very much affecting the way how our infectious diseases get distributed. And here you can see on the diagram various infectious disease threat events observed in a year between 2008 and 2013. And the events are represented by the black dots in the middle. And the diagram is split into sort of 4 compartments. So A is representing foodborne and waterborne diseases, B, vector-borne, rodent-borne diseases, C represents other zoonosis, and D, vaccine-preventable diseases. And then you can see that in each of these compartments, the black dots in the middle, the infectious disease threat events, are linked by lines to the various drivers at the top and the bottom of each event line. And these drivers, as you can see, are quite versatile, but climate does feature quite importantly in vector-borne and rodent-borne diseases, but also for foodborne and vector-borne diseases. And in Europe, climate seems to be particularly important for the vector-borne diseases. Of course, if we looked at another region, climate would probably be even more prominent and important driver. So what about the future? There are many studies trying to project how infectious disease distribution and spread will change in the future. So for example, under the 2.8-degree global warming scenario, half of the global population will be exposed to malaria vectors by 2050. Of course, there will be huge disparities by region. So for example, additional 74 million people will be facing endemic risk of malaria by 2080 in southern and southeastern Africa, but there will be no climate change effect in West Africa, or perhaps even a small net reduction in the malaria burden there. The risk of dengue is projected to increase across all continents and across all boundaries. Well, not all, many boundaries, sorry. So for example, dengue is projected to spread very much from the southern to the north central Mexico, and also to the midwestern regions of the US. In China, dengue exposure is projected to increase from 142 counties to 456 counties by the end of the 21st century. And many other infectious diseases will also shift and change their distribution. But as you can see from the image here on the slide, the infectious disease impacts will also be compounded by other climate change impacts on health, including heat, reduced labor capacity as a result of heat, food security issues, etc. So there will be a formation of hotspots of multiplicative climate change impacts on human health, potentially massively affecting health of people in these locations, and very much stretching the boundaries of the local healthcare system capacity. So what about the responses? Broadly, we could classify responses to infectious disease threats as responsive and anticipatory responses. So, as reactive and anticipatory responses. And example of reactive responses are integrated care management of the existing cases, integrated vector control management, and anticipatory responses include disease surveillance, early warning systems, vaccination, awareness rising about self-protection practices. For foodborne disease, it also includes improvements in the food processing and preservation practices, enhancement of the food storage and cold chains, and for infectious diseases, there can be various housing improvements, for example, closing eaves through which mosquitoes usually travel into homes, installing mosquito screens on the windows, etc. Many of these responses are typically local and implemented within national boundaries, but some can also be used across boundaries, for example, disease surveillance and early warning systems. And an example of a cross-boundary response is the development of the European Environment and Epidemiology Network by the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. And this network monitors environmental conditions related to infectious disease threats and analyzes the risks in Europe and beyond, including environmental susceptibility of malaria and the Vibrio species. So how to address transboundary risks?
Christine, can you go very quickly through this because we have to go to the next one.
So some of the recommendations are enhance the international research collaboration. We do need to share our research and the latest findings to help strengthen response strategies, medications, and the vaccines. We need international coordinated action, which is already regulated to some extent by international health regulations, although not many countries have sufficient capacity to comply with the regulations, unfortunately, at the moment. Therefore, it's particularly important to support countries with limited response capacity, and that's done by many international organizations, but even there are still gaps between the way how the organization's mandates and the responsibility regions are arranged. There's also an opportunity for integrating climate-informed disease surveillance and early warning response systems. And one initiative that is helping that is the Global Framework on Climate Services. And of course, we need to adopt the transboundary and transdisciplinary lens when we are developing appropriate adaptation solutions. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was great. We go straight to Sarah Opitz-Stapleton, who will talk about cross-border risks to livelihoods.
Great. Give me just a moment to share my screen. Can you all see? Great.
Yes, yes.
So I'm Sarah Opitz-Stapleton with the Global Risks and Resilience Program at ODI. In this chapter, we examined transboundary climate risks to livelihoods, and livelihoods are the capabilities, assets, and activities that enable people to make a living and to meet their daily needs. Collectively, the livelihoods build economic sectors. We're more familiar in some of the IPCC reports and the news reports about primary sector livelihoods related to farming, or to fishing, livestock, or mining. Secondary sectors are those that involve manufacturing and the production of goods from the outputs of primary sectors, such as agricultural value chains, dairy products, construction or utilities and power sectors. And then tertiary systems include healthcare, retail, tourism, hospitality, and the quaternary sector includes finance and IT, for example. In much of the research in the IPCC and news, focus on climate impacts tends to be on the direct and local impacts of today's climate hazards on livelihoods, and some mostly in the primary and some in the secondary sectors. And similarly, research on livelihoods also tends to focus on those two sectors, with characterization of climate risks to the other sectors less understood. Tracing the transboundary climate risk to livelihoods requires looking at the broader systems on which livelihoods depend. And we've heard some of this in some of the other chapters. Capacities such as the quality and access of healthcare or education at the local level depend on public policies and the degree of financing allocated at subnational to national systems. And individuals or households' access to savings, credit, or loans is shaped by broader governance of financial and macroeconomic systems. Critical assets needed to maintain livelihood activities, such as fertilizer for farming or veterinary drugs for livestock, the robustness and location of infrastructure like roads, electricity networks, or the internet for connectivity to regional and global markets, and the extent to which regional land and water resources have been degraded. Demand for products, market prices, and the strength of local to regional governance are also key components of the systems on which livelihoods depend. The impacts of climate extremes or shifts in seasons on any of the broader systems can have implications for livelihoods. And the policies, programs, and interventions, not only those related to adaptation and mitigation, but including things like structural adjustments or trade tariffs, progress or lack thereof towards the Sustainable Development Goals or the Sendai Agreement, as implemented by governments or organizations like the IMF or the WTO, will have knock-on indirect impacts at the livelihood level if they erode the assets and capacities of individuals, thereby making livelihoods more vulnerable to suffering harm when a climate shock occurs. The combination of all these also influence the success of individuals and their livelihoods, and whether the individual can intensify, diversify, or change livelihood activities entirely in response to shocks, or to meet individual aspiration. And as a result, some individual livelihoods, as well as clusters of livelihoods in some regions where systems are more fragile, are much more vulnerable to negative impacts when local to transboundary climate hazards occur. Some of the TCARs to the various systems, as cascading through livelihoods, have been mentioned by the previous authors and are covered in some of the other chapters. In this, and looking at some of the direct livelihoods impacts, again, the direct impacts are related primarily to large-scale impacts on terrestrial, ocean, and multi-country natural resource bases, and can impact the decline of areas suitable for agriculture, large-scale multi-country droughts, such as the ones we're currently seeing across the Horn of Africa, that is contributing to large-scale displacement. There have been mentions of livestock disease. And we know, for instance, by 2100, it is likely that 8% of current agriculture and livestock production areas could become unsuitable under an emission scenario in line with the Paris Agreement. That loss of agricultural lands rises to over 30% under higher emission scenarios. And we know that there are implications, as mentioned, due to heat stress and impacts on labor capacities. Indirect TCARs cascade through interconnected systems, through trade, finance, and policies, practices that hinder or enable human mobility, and that serve to disrupt livelihood inputs and outputs at local scale. So one quick example is looking at pastoral livelihoods in the Sahel. This is one area of primary livelihoods and also secondary leather and dairy goods, and that sort of aspect of livelihoods is less understood in the IPCC reports than agriculture and farming or fishing. So we're arguing more research needs to be done, especially given the very transboundary nature of pastoral livelihoods in general, that are dependent on moving across borders as a way of protecting herds and spreading risks. But 9 climate factors, particularly lack of land tenure security or anti-movement bans, the geopolitics of cross-border mobility, are threatening the resilient strategies of pastoralists and making them more vulnerable to transboundary risks. And then finally, in managing transboundary climate risks to livelihoods is, as we heard previously from the other authors, requires strengthening the policies and plans and interventions within systems themselves. The capacities and assets for livelihoods are enabled and constrained to some degree by government and international organizations' policies and plans, and their abilities to implement and enforce, to consider the knock-on effects. And we know that systems are not fair. Inequalities in socioeconomic development and political marginalization make some people and regions more vulnerable to transboundary climate risks. therefore, building in adaptation and of reducing maladaptation to various livelihoods requires a just strengthening of systems, not only incorporating the Paris Agreement goals within, but working to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and ensuring that these are resilient to risks by finding coherence between the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Agreement, and other international frameworks. So I thank you very much, and I'll leave it there.
Great, Sarah. This is also really, really interesting. And thanks also for making some of the connections to the other chapters in the report. So that concludes our overview of 4 of the significant transboundary climate risks that are presented in the report. We now have time for some questions, and thanks everyone for already using the Q&A box quite actively, and also to the authors for responding to several of the questions. There are still a few questions that I would like to ask the authors and the other speakers to ponder. For example, there's a question from Prabhakar from IGES, who asks if it's possible for countries to reconsider their national adaptation plans and address transboundary climate risks, and also improve risk assessments in subsequent iterations. So the big challenge, which Katie also outlined, how do we make sure that transboundary climate risks are in fact addressed and incorporated and considered in national adaptation plans? Who would like to respond to that?
I can give you one example from...
Go ahead, Jakob, absolutely.
From my time out in Asia, because of discussions that we had at our organization at EasyMod as well, where we have, as in the last year, used the word horizon scanning a lot in general for planning, and also especially around risk, that we do not make a next 5-year plan that is set in stone, but rather a plan that has as one essential aspect this, every half a year to kind of sit back and say, okay, are we still on track? So that and I think that so this is on our behalf, on a governmental organization that spans a couple of countries and is advising these countries. I think national disaster management authorities, or whatever ministries are responsible for addressing climate risks in the respective countries, also have to move away perhaps a bit from developing plans that are set in stone to something that can be revisited within the 5 years or 10-year plan that you have set up.
Adaptable adaptation plans, that's what you're arguing for. There is also a question on the extent to which regional collaboration might be useful in addressing transboundary climate risk. We've talked about Adaptation Without Borders, which is a global partnership, but what could be done at the regional level to address transboundary climate risk? Sarah, I see your hand. Go ahead.
It very much depends on the region, and as we've heard in this, partially answers one of the other questions about adaptation creating risks for other countries, is that transboundary climate risks can be geopolitically sensitive. This is something mentioned by the LDC chair and Nicole earlier. Toward that end, Adaptation Without Borders has been working with some of the regional economic communities in Africa and the African Union Commission, who are working to, one, start improving the climate risk assessments for the countries and developing methodologies and training on how to assess transboundary climate risks and bring them in, but also working more closely with the regional economic communities and within the African Union itself to find ways of diplomatically assessing risks jointly and across regions, and trying to find ways of negotiating solutions, particularly around transboundary shared natural resources, whether that's rivers along the Blue Nile. And this is a challenge, for instance, to Isatu's question with Ethiopia building hydropower dams, it might be good for Ethiopia's water security and food security going into the future, but it presents challenges for downstream countries. So the regional economic communities are one forum through which these challenges are beginning to be acknowledged and hopefully can find spaces for addressing them going forward.
Great, great. I'd like to ask a question to Katie. Actually, I'd like to combine two questions for Katie. One is to confirm which are actually the pathways through which transboundary climate risk propagates. And a question about the role of globalization, because some of these pathways aren't necessarily all about neighboring countries, but they connect countries that are sometimes in different continents. So what is the role of globalization, and how do we consider that in transboundary climate risk analysis and management? Is that something? Yes, Katie, go ahead.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, so we've done at SEI quite a lot of work led by Magnus Benzi and others in the team to try to conceptualize the sorts of categories or pathways through which transboundary climate risks propagate. For many years, we've categorized those into four big sort of classifications. So through trading relationships, through biophysical and natural resources, through international financial flows, and then through human mobility. Others have cut the cake in different ways and conceptualized them in different ways and added on other categories, such as through infrastructure or through geopolitical risks. There is a big project that we're working on at the moment called Cascades, which is looking at the cascading climate risks to impact Europe. And a really interesting paper that I'll put a link to in the chat there around which proposes a conceptual framework for defining these risks that include a number of pathways. I would say depending on which country you're looking at and which particular sector, you could identify all sorts of different pathways through which these risks propagate. And really the onus is on countries and companies and other actors who are doing adaptation strategies, planning adaptation strategies, to commission risk and vulnerability assessments that better account for the international nature of risk. Most adaptation plans are based on sort of traditional risk and vulnerability assessments that only look at climate impacts within a particular location, within a particular country. And when we start to factor in how a country might be exposed or vulnerable to climate impacts from overseas, it quickly becomes complex. These risks are cascading in their nature, as we've heard. They can be quite uncertain when we project into the future. And so that requires a really different process that we have to go through, a very different type of risk assessment, one that is likely to be much more qualitative, more collaborative, that engages ministries and stakeholders beyond the environment community to also work with trade ministries and finance ministries and foreign policy communities and so on. So I wouldn't get too caught up in sort of trying to come up with a perfect classification of all the different pathways through which they propagate, but it's just important to take a holistic perspective. And on the nature of globalization, I mean, a really important part of that process will be for countries to assess, well, how are they exposed to these risks through their international relationships, through their networks, depending on how sort of globalized they are. Some of the work that SEI has done has been to look at who is exposed to these risks. And it's very clear that it's not only developing countries, but it's also developed countries who are very sort of, well, every country in the world these days is globally integrated. But it really broadens sort of our view of who is most affected by climate change when you account for these risks.
Right. We have maybe time for 3 or 4 more questions, and I see some really good ones already in the Q&A box. Let's try to do this as quickly as possible. There's one really good question about transboundary maladaptation. What is it that could be done in terms of policy and are any global policy reforms needed to ensure that adaptation measures are taken in tandem with neighboring countries to minimize spillover effects? Let me just go through one or two more questions and then you can consider, this goes to all the speakers, which ones you would like to take. There is a question from Kit about the relative importance of these risks. The report presents 10 risks. Does it say anything about some that might be more important than others in terms of possible effect or possible policy priority? There is a question also about the slight differences between the presentations, some which were more concrete, others focused more on policy. Has that something to do with the maturity of the work and the organizations working on it? And then there's a really interesting question about how concretely would we like to see transboundary climate risks being integrated into the framework for the global goal and adaptation. And I would suggest that Salim takes that question into his reflections. And we hope to have another opportunity for Q&A after the perspectives from policy and practice. But let's focus on those questions. First, the one on maladaptation and what can policy do to avoid spillover effects. Who would like to take that one? Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Good question, and maybe the one of the most sensitive one with this topic. Very quickly, we don't have so much information on transboundary maladaptation. We have some examples in the report, and that's very useful. But definitely, we need more knowledge on that, and probably more research. And this is probably where the policy sensitivities will come, because it's about the responsibility of a given country or group of country towards other partners, neighboring or distant ones. And so this is why only relying on introducing transboundary risks in national adaptation plans will probably not be sufficient, because we can imagine that countries will be reluctant to also provide information on the negative consequences they have on the others. And so this is where probably regional and multilateral and probably global initiatives could add value on this topic. But this is really the heart of the transboundary climate risk issue. And we are, I think, close to the beginning of having robust information. But science is going fast, so.
Thanks, Alex. And maybe you or Ari could also respond to the question of the relative importance of these risks. Are there some risks that stand out, or have you actually tried to rank them in terms of importance?
Well, I can start and Ari can complete. We didn't do that because this is precisely what we are trying to say in the last part of the report. We need some material to be able to compare these different sectors. And so we didn't do any ranking at this stage, but we recognize that this is probably one of the further steps. Maybe Ari, you want to add?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where we're going next forward, is how we can prioritize some of these transboundary climate risks using different types of methodologies. And I think that what will be interesting is not only maybe listing them, but seeing if there's interconnections, critical transboundary climate risks that are interconnected to others that can we wait on, that could have in particular policy importance in terms of how we can coordinate action. So I think this will be the next important step to look at, and could be very informative for also how national adaptation plans can grow in terms of scale to look more beyond the borders. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. And what about the perhaps difference in level of concreteness or maturity, perhaps even in assessing the various risks, where some perhaps have more empirical information to present than others. Is that something worth reflecting on? Sarah, go ahead, and then Jakob, and then we'll go to the next part of the agenda.
I certainly think it is. In trying to assess transboundary climate risk to livelihoods is very difficult. Most of the research and work tends to focus on the direct and localized impacts. And where there has been research on transboundary climate risks, it's at the system level and more for the macroeconomic impacts. So there's definitely more work needed on that to understand how things are propagating through the systems on which livelihoods are depending, and also how policy responses and interventions, different programs by actors such as the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, can further impact livelihoods and cascade through.
Great, go ahead, Jakob. And I see more hands coming up. I'll draw a line under Jensen. So Jakob and Jensen, and then we'll go to the next one. But please go ahead.
Also, I really just want to echo what Sarah already mentioned, also for transboundary terrestrial or transboundary risks and for terrestrial variables. What I think, so what is still lacking is looking a bit beyond the local and direct impacts. And what I think what we are lacking in our domain, at least, is interdisciplinarity. So we have a lot of physical scientists looking at the problem themselves. We have social scientists looking at the problem themselves. So I really hope in that domain we have more economists, social scientists, and physical scientists working together. I think this has worked in this report already quite nicely, from what I understand, and because otherwise this is never going to go beyond those small problems.
Great, and then Jensen, please.
Thank you very much. I just want to quickly respond to the question about the maturity and the urgency. So related to the urgency question, so yes, actually, when we were drafting this report, I was more focusing on the renewable integration. That issue is more important in terms of the energy security. So we were focusing on the interconnected network, which will allow more integration of variable renewables, particularly in many countries which are aiming for the clean energy transitions. But also currently we are looking at other type of energy security issues, for example, gas supply, and also the critical minerals, critical material supply for the clean energy system. So I would say the urgency and the development of the discussion is really depending on the requirements by the time. And in terms of the maturity, there's some questions about the other sectors, about like gas or those kind of international collaboration on this kind of topic. And definitely there are some kind of discussion, but we haven't really conducted in-depth analysis from our side. But I believe there is already increasing discussions about interconnectedness and also the climate impacts on the transboundary energy systems for the gas and also the critical minerals. So that's the part we would like to work more.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to all the authors and editors of the report. This was a really interesting and very good introduction into the report. The link to the report will be put in the chat again soon. And thanks also for all the questions, and keep those questions coming. The authors will continue to also respond in writing in the Q&A box. But we'll also now hear from policy and practice. We were very honored that Her Excellency Minister Aminath Shorna from the Maldives has recorded a video presentation that we can now listen to. Unfortunately, the sound quality isn't too great. So if you do have access to a headphone, then this is a good time to use it, or otherwise put up the volume. It's about a 7-minute video, and after Minister Shorna, we will hear from Salim Al-Haq. Thank you, and please start the video now.
Greetings everyone from the Maldives. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today for the launching of the Adaptation Without Borders flagship report on global transboundary climate risks. For a small island developing state like the Maldives, adaptation could not be more important. Climate change is a multiplier in exacerbating underlying issues and cascading climate impacts add even more pressure on domestic resources and our ability to respond. Adaptation is implemented and envisioned locally, but the elements should be global, reflecting the transboundary nature of climate impacts. This is very important to emphasize because if we fail to move past discussing only the local level of adaptation, we will neglect some very significant adaptation needs and opportunities. Take, for example, food security. Food import dependence is increasing globally, along with food insecurity. At 1.5 degrees, extreme weather events become a high risk. These events can cause shocks throughout the supply chain, which can drive production collapse, increase transport disturbances, especially in choking points, and increase food security issues. All of these risks must be taken into account as governments think about adaptation in the food sector. Without regional and global planning and cooperation, any shock to the supply chain could have far-reaching consequences for food security in countries throughout the world. The Maldives is a low-lying atoll nation. We have the world's most sustainable fisheries, but we're far from being self-sufficient. We rely on imports from the rest of the world for a huge portion of our food supply. Because of this, it is only too easy to envision a supply chain shock elsewhere in the world, completely disrupting our access to staple food products. The same sort of cascading risks and thinking apply to other sectors that are critical to well-being for our people and planet, like water, health, and biodiversity. Without adaptation cooperation at a regional and global level, actions taken by governments will remain incremental instead of transformational. By this, I mean that without larger scale thinking and planning, governments will continue to adapt and readapt in their own countries to changing climate scenarios instead of thinking systematically and working together to reduce the underlying causes of issues like food or water insecurity or healthcare and loss of biodiversity. So this ties into the UNFCCC negotiations on the global goal and adaptation and the importance of collective action being reflected in it. At the most general level, our view is that GGA is to ensure human and planet well-being, even in the face of increasing adverse climate impacts. Adaptation actions that further this goal should be measured by their effect on present and future human well-being. We believe that the framework will be a useful tool to organize adaptation information, enhance the quality of adaptation actions, and guide them toward a global goal of well-being for people and the planet. Negotiators have been working hard since COP27 to develop a framework that can do this. My hope is that this framework will provide an organizational tool for countries to input their adaptation information, but also an overarching guide to help move countries from local incremental adaptation to transformational adaptation that accounts for transboundary risks. The basis of the framework is the adaptation policy cycle, with a view toward ensuring that all countries and regions have robust processes on adaptation. The inclusion of themes and cross-cutting considerations is meant to guide these processes toward the overarching well-being goal, to ensure that we not only have robust adaptation processes, but that we have them in key areas that affect the well-being of every community, country, and region, no matter the location or context. That's why, in our view, using the themes food, water, health, ecosystems, and infrastructure makes the most sense. These themes are broad enough that they can be applied everywhere, but still at a level of specificity to the GGA that will help move it forward. They are also, you might notice, all transboundary by nature. We hope that the final framework to be adopted at COP28 can help to cement this understanding of the GGA so that it can influence local, national, regional, and global adaptation policymaking. The 2023 Transboundary Climate Risk Report by Adaptation Without Borders provides much needed information on 10 of the major transboundary climate risks that are relevant to adaptation. It is exciting because it can help us move conversations forward in a more concrete way, both at the political level and at the technical level in these negotiations. Just to reiterate our view in the Maldives, the global goal in adaptation should be global collective in action and reflect greater balance between major components of the Paris Agreement. And more importantly, it should be transformative. I keep mentioning GGA as well-being for people and planet, but I just want to leave you all with a more personal and tangible picture of what this means to me. Well-being for my people and my part of the planet in the Maldives means that Maldivians all have access to nutritious diets and safe drinking water. It means that they're healthy and have access to quality healthcare and are not at heightened risks of disease or other health scares. It means that our coral reefs are alive. Along with abundant marine life, they provide a home to and the fisheries they support. And most importantly, it means that Maldivians have stable homes to live in and land to live on the Maldives, and that my daughter and her children after her are able to continue living in the country that we call home.
Thank you so much, Minister Shauna. I think it is very encouraging to hear the Minister call for systemic policy, a policy that takes into account the connections across scales and across countries. And it would be wonderful to hear from you, Salim, on not only your reflections on what the Minister has just said, but on the report and on the need to respond to transboundary climate risks as they have just been presented in this session. And Salim is Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh and a global voice for the vulnerable and marginalized in the world. Over to you, Salim. And if you could limit your contribution to about 10 minutes, that would be wonderful. Salim, do we still have you online? That would be unfortunate if we no longer have Salim. We try one more time. Salim, are you still with us? That does not appear to be the case. In that case, we still have a whole bunch of questions that we can go through, and we will hope that Salim will be able to connect within a few minutes and we can still hear from him. But if that's not the case, then I would suggest that we pick up some of the questions that we were not able to address in the earlier Q&A round. There was, for example, a question from Clemens Hasser, who I think has been answered now, but maybe we can still hear the question as it was posed, which is about the role of trade agreements. We know that trade is an important pathway for propagating risk from one part of the world to another. We haven't talked about that in great detail during this particular session, but perhaps we can hear from some of the people who have worked on trade what the particular trade-related risks are, and if there is a role for trade agreements in reducing the risk. And I'm asking some of the speakers, but perhaps there are also some people who are able to respond as well. Who would like to go first? My default option is you, Katie.
Sure. We have looked quite extensively at SEI on how transboundary climate impacts around the world are projected to create risks for both at a country level in terms of how a country might be exposed to transboundary climate risks because of the commodities, often including essential food commodities that they import. We've also looked at this topic from a more global perspective. We have all seen from the COVID pandemic and other global disruptions how vulnerable our global supply chains can be to disruptions. And climate change can also be a catalyst for those sorts of disruptions, both when it affects the production of critical, including agricultural commodities, but also the transport and distribution of those. So again, we can include some links in the chat. We have some colleagues of mine at SEI, so Frida Lager and Magnus Benzi, have recently released a report that looks at a national level case study, so Sweden's exposure to transboundary climate risks through trade. We also, a couple of years ago, released a big global assessment looking at 6 major commodities around the world and how they could be affected by transboundary climate risks, and which countries around the world are major exporters of risk, and which countries are particularly vulnerable because of the levels of risk, the levels of commodities that they import, and how essential some of those commodities are for food security. And I think we focused a lot in this session on the role of adaptation planning and adaptation policy to manage these risks. But trade policy is a critical area as well that could strengthen the governance and management of these risks, both at a national level, but also at a global level. And I would encourage you all to have a look at the latest big flagship report of the World Trade Organization, which has a big focus on transboundary climate risk and the role that actors in trade, both in the public and private sector, can play to manage those risks. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks so much, Katie. Sarah, you would like to respond as well. Go ahead.
So just to add to that, within trade policies, the setting of standards, such as phytosanitary standards, can play an important role in managing both livestock and crop disease. And there are efforts underway within countries, the regional bodies in Africa, to strengthen standards, reporting and disease surveillance networks, and bringing that into phytosanitary standards that are improved within various trade policies. These things are also being raised. ODI and the International Livestock Research Institute have been working with various policymakers in Africa on this. And when we started discussing transboundary climate risks, there was an agreement of needing to bring these things to the Phytosanitary Committee, for instance, at the World Trade Organization. So there are needs to do this. And as Katie said, well, we focused a bit on adaptation plans. In the end, adaptation is something that has to be incorporated within all policies. Otherwise, a standalone adaptation plan is not going to achieve very much.
Great, thanks very much. I see another really interesting question in the Q&A, and Jakob and Sarah have already responded to that, and that is about the consideration of limits to adaptation in transboundary climate risk management. And of course, there is an important link between the reaching of limits and the discussion on loss and damage. Is there anybody else who would like to reflect on the connection between transboundary climate risks and limits to adaptation and loss and damage? Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe a quick reflection. I mean, this topic of limits to adaptation and including residual risk is growing, and the science is starting to understand what does it mean concretely, soft limits, hard limits, and so on, with a quite local perspective usually. And my personal feeling is that transboundary climate risk is also a way to understand limits, and probably a way to better characterize these limits beyond the local or the national level. So there is for sure something useful around that. And maybe transboundary climate risk, a better understanding of this kind of risk can help advance discussions on loss and damages. Yeah, sure.
Christine, you would also like to respond, and I think it also perhaps relates to an answer you gave to a question to Prabhakar, so maybe you can also bring that in.
Thank you. I think when we're talking about the limits to adaptation and the loss and damage mechanisms, a lot also comes down to the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for what? Who was responsible for certain actions that didn't get taken, and we actually ended up having greater risks than we could have had? And how can we prove the evidence? There's a lot of sort of discussion and idea, and in fact, colleagues and I were writing a paper on how do we attribute health impacts of climate change to the point that that evidence can be used in lawsuits between countries. And certain countries can be taken to responsibility for the damage done to other countries who eventually suffer the impact. But again, the science of attribution is quite complex, and we do certainly need some advancements in the way how we are doing attribution science and how well it can be used for such arguments.
Thank you. Hari?
Thanks, Richard, and for the audience for such a good question. Indeed, in the human mobility chapter, we do address to some extent the need to look further into these adaptation limits. While the deep dive focuses on these temporary seasonal work labor arrangements, there's also a question of, especially in consideration of small island developing states, some loss, the climate change risks on loss of livelihoods, or even in displacement because of extreme events, and what that will mean for potential mobility patterns globally. So I think that this is a pertinent question, and we'll be looking deeper into it.
Great. I have just heard news that the internet is down for Salim, so it looks like he will not be able to join us in the next 10 minutes or so. And if he does, then of course we will give him the floor. But in the meantime, if you have any further questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We might have time to ask the authors to reflect on them. There is one more question from David Marioni, who asks about the link between adaptation and transboundary climate risks and degrowth, and focusing on quality life rather than GDP. So is there anybody in the panel who would like to reflect on the necessity, possibility or not of degrowth and the link to transboundary climate risk?
I will take a stab at this, but say by no means preface, I'm not an expert. I think this is ultimately the challenge of one of the things that we talk about, just transformations within adaptation, is what kind of economy and quality of life do we want going forward into the future. This is the challenge that we're faced with, figuring out restructuring our economies, and also the politics of money and where our power is distributed. I think this is something that we need to start having discussion, and maybe it might take raising some of the financial implications and potentially some of the political implications to countries, to politicians, and then financial implications to major businesses, to start getting them to think in terms of why it is important to shift for good business. I don't see us being able to win people over just by sheer appealing to better natures or justice. Unfortunately, that's not something that's driven yet, but we need to have the conversations, I think, starting of where certain systems and people are at, and then moving towards those discussions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. There are still a few more questions in the Q&A, and I also see that some of us are responding to it. But let me just ask another question, primarily to Alex and Ari, but also to Katie and others. This was is the 2023 Global Transboundary Climate Risk Report. The inclusion of the year there suggests that there might be a 2024 or 2025 or 2033 report at some point. What are your plans, and what would you like to see in any future reports?
I'm happy to take off, Alex, if you'd like to join in. But so this was a big effort that took over a year to produce. So 2024 might be a bit tight in terms of getting the next one out, but there's a lot of interest that we've gathered through contacting experts to contribute to this report, and we're very much eager to continue the endeavor. So maybe 2025 flagship report would be more reasonable. And in the last part of this report, we do lay down the groundwork for research and work to come on transboundary climate risks. Some of them that we've addressed today in the webinar, such as developing some assessment methodologies, understanding if prioritization of certain transboundary climate risks is possible, and other policy implications. So really thinking about what does multi-scale policy mean in terms of transboundary climate risks at the local, the national, regional, and global level. So there's a lot of work still to do on this. And I think also one of the great contributions that this report does is bring together a collection of evidence. For the first time, we have different types of transboundary climate risks, illustrative case studies all brought together, which can help start to compare different types of dynamics and pathways and implications for policy and governance. So I hope that this can also continue, that we keep feeding into this evidence base, because I think that will be really critical for informing policy down the road. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, just to say that, as usual, the more you know, the more questions you have. So there are plenty, a lot of possibilities in terms of the scope, in terms of the timing. Also, we don't have specific plans for that for the moment at the Adaptation Without Borders level, but this is definitely something we will have to discuss soon. Yeah, there are plenty of opportunities. So this really needs a discussion within the partnership.
Well, maybe we can already ask the director of the partnership what your vision is, Katie.
I would certainly love to see this report become more regularly released. There is so many other sectors that we could explore. There are so many other case studies in particular countries or particular regions that are really worthy of further exploration. And of course, these risks will change over time. So there is a need for the research and academic community to be monitoring these risks and identifying how they change and what kind of threat they pose to our economies and environments and societies. So I very much hope that this is the first of with more additions to come. Richard, while I've got the floor, maybe I can just answer one of the questions in the chat, which was around the global goal on adaptation. There is this framework being developed this year, and the question was, what would we concretely like to see on transboundary climate risks in that framework? This is something that we're going to be doing some more work on over the coming months, but I think we would already can say that we would like to see transboundary climate risks sort of referenced in a high-level indicator or objective, that this global goal on adaptation should be about building resilience to the impacts of climate change, sort of from the local to the global level. And as such, it really presents us with an opportunity to include a high-level indicator or objective that would see us strengthening our resilience and our cooperation to manage these risks. But to also see transboundary risks sort of mainstreamed throughout the different themes and dimensions and the different stages of the adaptation policy cycle that we've seen and that we've discussed today. So there is a need in all of those 7 stages of the adaptation planning cycle for transboundary climate risks to be considered, right from the early stages of risk assessment all the way through to implementation and monitoring and evaluating. We've also seen today just how transboundary climate risks, how relevant they are to all the different dimensions that are being considered, all the different thematic dimensions under that framework. So I would like to see some real high-level ambition to sort of manage transboundary climate risks in that global goal on adaptation. And I think it is where the goal can really add value. And it's a real shame that we don't have Salim with us today. I hope we can get a copy of his remarks and share them alongside the video that we send out. But I don't want to speak on his behalf, but I think he would be championing a message that this is not about sort of global action on adaptation supplanting or sort of taking priority over the local. These days, what is local is global, and what is global is local. And we really need to equip our local communities, our local actors, with the tools, the information, and the plans and actions they need to reduce their vulnerability to transboundary climate risk. They will ultimately be on the sharp end of these risks. And we also need to harness all of the knowledge and ideas that are happening at the local level as we think through how to manage these at national, regional, and global levels. So this is really a sort of clarion call for actors at all levels to get involved and really put adaptation on a par with mitigation in seeing it as the global challenge that it is and deserves to be.
Right. Thank you, Katie. And on that note, it is up to me to thank all the speakers and thank the audience for your questions, your interest in this topic. I think what I have got out of this session is transboundary climate risk is a new challenge, and it's for us all to manage. I think also the UNFCCC conversations, the workshops, the technical dialogues that we've had over the past few years under the GGA, but also the global stocktake, have shown that this is an adaptation issue that is not polarizing at this point. This is not about the global north having one focus and one position and the global south having a different one, and that being politicized. What we've seen so far is that all countries and also all constituencies have understood the importance of this particular topic and are keen to learn more about it and to make sure that it is reflected appropriately in the places where it is needed, whether that is a national adaptation plan process, whether it's a GGA, the global stocktake, adaptation communications, or elsewhere. And I think that is very encouraging. It is very encouraging to see a topic under the UNFCCC that shows that we're all in this together, we're all in the same boat, and that indeed shows very clearly that adaptation is a global challenge, as the Paris Agreement says in Article 7. I also think that transboundary climate risks present opportunities, not only risks, but there are opportunities to demonstrate how, for example, domestic adaptation efforts help to build regional and global resilience, how they strengthen the supply of exports on which others depend, and enhance the resilience of, for example, financial investments from overseas donors or investors, and adapt critical ecosystems. I think this is also showing that adaptation domestically remains important, but we are equally dependent on successful adaptation elsewhere. I was in Iceland just beginning of this week, and it struck me just how similar some of the challenges that Iceland is facing, how similar they are to those that the Maldives are changing, not in terms of sea level rise, but in terms of, for example, its dependence on food imports. And both Iceland and the Maldives are very much dependent on adaptation success elsewhere in the countries where their food is being produced. And I think that is that sort of global dynamic where we do not have a global north pitting against a global south or the other way around is really what is needed at the moment to move adaptation forward, not only under the UNFCCC, but everywhere. So on that note, thanks very much again. This webinar was brought to you by Adaptation Without Borders. If you'd like to join our community, go to adaptationwithoutborders.org and sign up for the newsletter, or get in touch with Katie. Thank you very much.